Putin's nuclear threat just paralyzed NATO. Alliance leaders in full panic. Mir's timer. In exactly 67 minutes, Vladimir Putin broke the most powerful military alliance in human history. No missiles launched, no tanks rolled. Just one credible threat that sent NATO's trillion-dollar war machine into full retreat. I was monitoring secure communications when it happened. At 14:23 Moscow time, Putin made a statement that wasn't broadcast on television, wasn't published in newspapers, wasn't tweeted to the world. It was delivered through diplomatic channels directly to NATO headquarters. 67 minutes later, every major weapon shipment to Ukraine was quietly suspended. This is the moment NATO died as a credible force, not with explosions or dramatic surrenders, but with the quiet acknowledgement that their red lines were always imaginary, and Putin's are written in radiation. Let me walk you through the psychology of institutional terror that's gripping Western capitals right now. 3 weeks ago, NATO officials spoke confidently about as long as it takes and whatever it takes. Today, those same officials are using phrases like sustainable support and avoiding escalation. The language shift isn't subtle. It's the sound of a superpower alliance discovering it's not actually super. The phone call started immediately. Emergency sessions in Brussels, panicked conferences in Berlin, hushed conversations in Washington, where words like unthinkable and civilization ending dominated secure lines. Not because Russian forces had achieved some tactical breakthrough, but because Putin had achieved something far more devastating. He made NATO leaders realize they're not actually willing to die for Ukraine. Here's what nobody's telling you about those 67 minutes. Putin's message wasn't a threat of nuclear war. It was a promise of nuclear inevitability. There's a crucial difference. Threats imply choice, negotiation, off-ramps. Inevitability means once certain lines are crossed, physics takes over, and human decisioning becomes irrelevant. The Pentagon's response was immediate and telling. Within hours, advanced missile systems that were promised to Ukraine in January were under review indefinitely. Fighter jets scheduled for spring delivery became stuck in training protocols. Long-range strike capabilities that Ukraine desperately needed were reclassified as escalatory and removed from aid packages entirely. This isn't bureaucratic delay. This is institutional paralysis in the face of existential terror. Because here's the brutal mathematics that NATO war games keep producing. In every scenario where the alliance directly confronts Russia over Ukraine, the probability of nuclear exchange exceeds 60% within the first week. Every scenario, no exceptions. And once that number hits decision-makers' desks, courage becomes a luxury they can't afford. Intelligence sources report that NATO's Supreme Allied Commander has privately circulated what he calls a nuclear reality assessment. The document, classified at the highest levels, concludes that any direct NATO-Russia conflict has a catastrophically high probability of escalating beyond conventional weapons within 72 hours. The assessment includes projections that should terrify anyone who reads them. 100 million dead in the first hour of nuclear exchange. Global economy collapsed within weeks. Food distribution systems destroyed. Civilization regressing by centuries. These aren't hypothetical numbers. They're computer models based on current nuclear arsenals and delivery systems. Putin understood this psychology better than NATO understood itself. While Western leaders were calculating political costs and alliance credibility, he was calculating survival probabilities and acceptable losses. The asymmetry is staggering. This is why NATO's counter-strategy has been so incoherent and obviously improvised. They're trying to appear strong while acting weak, trying to support Ukraine while avoiding confrontation, trying to deter Russia while accepting Russian deterrence. The contradictions are tearing the alliance apart from within. European capitals are fracturing under this pressure. Poland privately requested clarification of Article 5 guarantees in nuclear scenarios. Germany has quietly begun diplomatic outreach to Moscow through Swiss intermediaries. France is reportedly conducting its own strategic assessment of nuclear risks that bypasses NATO coordination entirely. The most revealing indicator of NATO's terror is what they're not saying publicly. No official will guarantee that NATO will defend every inch of Allied territory against nuclear-armed aggression. The Article 5 commitment, once considered sacred, is now hedged with conditions, qualifications, and escape clauses, but the psychological damage runs deeper. Putin's 67-minute power play didn't just change NATO's Ukraine policy. It revealed that Western nuclear deterrence was always a bluff that only worked against opponents who believed it. Once someone calls that bluff credibly enough, the entire system collapses. Russian military doctrine assumes that wars with NATO will escalate to nuclear weapons quickly. The entire concept of escalate to de-escalate exists precisely because Russia cannot win a prolonged conventional war against the alliance. Nuclear signaling isn't Putin's last resort. It's his first option because it's his only guaranteed advantage. This is psychological warfare of the highest order. Every delayed weapons shipment proves Russian deterrence works. Every restricted capability demonstrates Western fear. Every cancelled exercise shows alliance paralysis. Putin is systematically dismantling NATO's credibility without firing a shot. Meanwhile, leaked Pentagon assessments reveal the depth of institutional panic. Military commanders are recommending strategic disengagement from confrontational postures. Intelligence agencies warn of cascading escalation risks that make conventional deterrence obsolete. Defense ministers are openly questioning whether Article 5 commitments are sustainable in a nuclear environment. The alliance that once stared down the Soviet Union is paralyzed by the prospect of a nuclear winter. The powers that rebuilt Europe from atomic ashes are terrified of creating new ones. The institutions that guaranteed decades of peace are discovering that some prices are too high to pay even for peace. China is watching everything, every NATO hesitation, every caveat, every quiet retreat. Beijing's takeaway isn't that Russia is right or wrong. It's that nuclear-armed great powers can impose limits on stronger coalitions if they're willing to absorb pain and credibly signal escalation. That lesson will loom large over Taiwan. We're witnessing the controlled demolition of the post-Cold War, not through military conquest, but through the credible threat of mutual annihilation. Putin has weaponized NATO's own survival instinct against their strategic commitments. The psychological warfare is working because the threat is existential. While NATO's stakes are merely strategic, Putin isn't protecting territory or influence. He's protecting regime survival, which means he's willing to risk everything because losing everything is the alternative. This realization is spreading through Allied capitals like a contagion. If NATO won't risk nuclear war for Ukraine, will they risk it for Estonia, for Poland, for anyone? The logic that protects Moscow from NATO escalation also protects Moscow from NATO deterrence. Putin's red line isn't about Ukraine. It's about testing whether NATO's guarantees mean anything when survival is at stake. The answer revealed through alliance behavior since that 67-minute moment is no. NATO's guarantees are conditional on the threats being manageable. Nuclear threats aren't manageable. This is the moment historians will mark as the end of Western military dominance. Not because NATO lost a war, but because NATO chose not to fight one. Putin drew a line in radioactive sand, and the most powerful alliance in human history decided not to cross it. The intelligence reports I've seen suggest this is just the beginning. Putin's success in paralyzing NATO with nuclear psychology has emboldened other autocratic powers to test similar strategies. Beijing is reportedly studying Moscow's playbook for potential application in the South China Sea. Iran is recalibrating its nuclear program timeline based on demonstrated Western fear thresholds. The alliance's internal communications reveal growing awareness of this domino effect. Defense ministers are privately acknowledging what they can't say publicly. Nuclear deterrence only works against rational actors who value preservation over victory. Putin has demonstrated that leaders facing existential regime threats operate under different calculations entirely. NATO's worst nightmare is materializing. A world where nuclear-armed autocracies coordinate their use of existential threats to freeze democratic responses to territorial expansion. The 67 minutes that broke NATO may have broken the entire post-war international system. The weapons that were supposed to deter aggression have become instruments of paralysis. The alliance built to project strength has become a coalition of the terrified. The nuclear umbrella that protected democracy has become a nuclear shadow that protects autocracy. What terrifies Western intelligence most is that Putin's formula is already spreading. Autocratic regimes worldwide are studying how 67 minutes of credible nuclear signaling can neutralize decades of alliance building and democratic deterrence. The precedent has been set, and the psychological template is now available for replication by any nuclear-armed state facing existential pressure from democratic coalitions. In 67 minutes, Vladimir Putin proved that in the nuclear age, the side willing to risk annihilation controls escalation. NATO learned they value survival more than victory. And once that calculation becomes clear, every other calculation changes. Putin broke NATO by forcing them to confront a simple question. Is Ukraine worth human civilization? NATO's answer delivered through bureaucratic delay and strategic retreat was no. And Putin is already preparing his